Hey there, I'm Krista Vance, entrepreneur and operations leader.
And I'm Matt Vance, award-winning author and social innovation researcher. We're your hosts of the Culture Profit Podcast.
Your place for purposeful company culture strategy.
Learn from HR pros, executives, and thought leaders how to prioritize profits by prioritizing people.
This episode is sponsored by Mobrium, the best friend of forward-thinking HR leaders, helping you strengthen your employer reputation as a reflection of your real culture.
Learn more at mobrium.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Culture Profit Podcast. I'm your co-host, Matt Vance.
And I'm your co-host, Krista Vance. The Culture Profit is a podcast series obsessed with one question: how can culture drive greater profits? We're thrilled to welcome Juli Weber, Leader Development Director of Conservice, the nation's largest utility management provider servicing over 5 million locations throughout North America. Can you say hi, Juli?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, let's get to know a little bit about Juli. So in the past, Juli has worked also for Malou, the Perch Group, the Huntsman School of Business, and as an adjunct professor, the Campbell Soup Corporation, and the Pepperidge Farm brand, Yesco Electronics, and Hollywood Video and Training and HR roles. So she's got lots of human resource experience. She's also a Utah State University graduate, go Aggies, with a master's degree in instructional technology and learning sciences, and also has a Master of Management degree from the University of Phoenix Online. She has served on the Bridgerland SHRM chapter board for the past 10 years and has been married to her sweetheart, Mike, for 25 years. And together they have 2 awesome kids and 1 amazing daughter-in-law. Outside of work, Juli is always making time to paint, glue, sew, plant, or flip something. She also likes to spend time with her family, watch Friends reruns, and is a self-proclaimed HGTV junkie. Awesome. So great to have you here with us, and let's just get right into it. So you're our very first guest on the Culture Profit Podcast. When making the list, you were the one we wanted to call. You were the very first. And we're so excited to have you here. We knew your extensive experience in the HR space, intentionally building positive experiences for employees, would be very valuable to other HR pros and leaders. So to start the conversation, tell us about why you got into HR.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me again. And these are pretty high expectations you have that I'm your first guest, but I'll try to live up to them. So why did I get into HR? Interestingly enough, I actually sort of fell into HR. I was working at the time in training and development, and actually I grew up wanting to be a teacher and fell in love with teaching, and I actually taught dance when I was in high school. And I loved it. My mom was a teacher, my grandma, my aunts. It was just like a family thing. So I just assumed I would always just be a teacher. And I ended up working in a retail organization, and they had training roles. And I was like, oh, well, training's like teaching. So I started doing training and development and just fell in love with it, of course, as I knew I would. And the organization changed a little bit, and we went from reporting to operations to reporting to human resources. And so that was my first exposure. And then the industry changed because nobody rents videos in a video store anymore. And I experienced my first layoff. So, and we could someday talk about why change bites you in the butt, but that would be another call. Anyway, I could tell you some fun stories there, but anyway, and so this was, during the Great Recession, and my sister was doing the master's program at Utah State in HR, and she's like, you should really look at HR roles. And so I did, and I actually looked into getting my PHR, which is a national HR certification. And so she and I prepped and studied together and sat for that test. And I got it. I passed, surprisingly. And then every role since then has been an element of HR. And I've just become impassioned with people and helping people and solving problems. Somebody said the other day, most people don't get into HR because they like people. They get into HR because they like to solve problems. Luckily, I like both. So I like to help people, and I love to see people be successful, which is interesting because in HR, typically we're pegged as the one that are firing people, which I don't believe that's true. I think people fire themselves. But I do like to help solve problems. And so that's why I'm in HR.
That does sound like the perfect blend for the job. That's awesome. So I'm just throwing out there a fun kind of get to know you question. What's the most interesting thing you've ever put on your resume?
Oh, that's fun. And I have seen a lot of interesting things as I've looked at a lot of resumes over the year. But a long time ago, when I was trying to decide where I was going in a career and my kids were little, I actually put on my resume that under like skills and hobbies at the bottom, I put that I could potty train a 2-year-old and that I could do a mean tap dance. And which, I mean, both were true, but you wouldn't think to put those on the resume, but that actually made it memorable. And the hiring manager said, he's like, because you put those things on your resume, I actually reached out to you, and then I ended up getting the job. So I when you can potty train a 2-year-old, that's pretty cool. And that only happened for one of my kids. The other one, it took a lot longer, but so maybe it wasn't a skill I should brag about. But anyway, that's probably the craziest thing I've put on there. But I do try to keep something personal and maybe a little lighthearted on my resume currently, just because that's a big part of who I am. So I want to show that.
That's a great accomplishment.
Well, right. I know you have your own children, so anyone who knows can relate.
Well, and I think that's such a great tip for those who are creating their resumes. Add something fun and personal, something that will help you stand out. I love that.
Yeah, that's super important.
Well, thanks for being here, Julie. We're so excited to have this conversation today. So I'm going to set the stage here a little bit. So you're an HR leader at Conservice, the nation's largest utility management company. You guys are servicing over 5 million locations, as Krista mentioned. It's a huge operation. Multifamily communities, commercial properties, single-family homes, student housing, military housing, and more. I mean, that's a lot to take care of. So before this episode, you shared that there has been a lot of change at the company recently. As we all experienced COVID, the operations went remote, everything had to change. But you've also welcomed a new CEO, Scott Hardy, and executive team. Add to that, the employee base has doubled from 2,000 to over 4,000. That's a lot of change. So Julie, tell us about, from your perspective, having navigated so much change at Conservice, how can company culture drive greater profits?
That is such a good question, and I'm going to do my best to answer it. For all your listeners, it's just my perspective. So, right, this is just Julie's humble opinion, if you will. But I was in the heart of it all when COVID hit. I had been here at Conservice just about 6 months, and my role at the time was I was the leader over recruiting. And when I started in August of 2019, we had 1,800 employees, and I had about, I think there was 6 or 7 of us on the recruiting team. And we were hiring only in our offices. We had a handful of offices across the country, but that's where we were mainly hiring. All our interviews were in person. We were taking, resumes in person in some cases. Anyway, there was just some crazy stuff. And COVID just said, nope, just kidding. Let's do things very differently, which was, we're not the only ones to experience that. But from, like you said, sending, people home to work where we didn't work. I mean, people were literally taking their office chairs and putting their tower and their monitors on their office chair and wheeling it out to their cars. And we didn't distribute laptops at the time. Everyone used a tower, a desktop. Anyway, just so many crazy things that had to go into that change. We had to think differently about how we recruited. We had to think differently about how we interviewed. We did an assessment on site when people would come in to test their computer skills. We had to figure out how to do that online. I mean, there was just so many things. And I'll tell you, Conservice has amazingly like stepped up to the plate, if you will. We have just been able to rebound and flex in so many different ways, from, again, sending people home to now buying laptops to hiring and training our employees remotely, because that's what we ran into. And unemployment in our market, in our area, is just incredibly low. It was pre-pandemic. It was during the pandemic. We were always below the state, but also nationally. So there was just so many factors. Our founder and CEO retired in August of 2020. We had a new CEO step in. He brought new executive leaders. We have a new leader in HR now. We have shifted people around. It's so crazy how you get so, at least for me, I get so wrapped up in what my expectation is of what my career path should be, what my next role should be. And we've sort of broken the mold, and some willingly and some maybe not so willingly, but we have shifted leaders around where we have identified opportunities for skill gap or growth. And so that's shifted people. We've brought departments together. We've separated them back out. We've tried hiring just locally. We've gone back to hiring remotely. Like, there has just been so many things because of the need to change, and the culture piece along with all of that. So I'm just setting the stage there of what the culture could look like and what it is. And the opportunities there, you have to be intentional about culture. You can't just let it do its thing. And every time you bring a new individual into your team or into your department or into your organization, actually influences the culture. And so you have to be cognizant about what that looks like. And when you're choosing who gets to come into your organization from a recruiting standpoint, and at the height of the pandemic, I had 25 recruiters, and I'm trying to teach them all how to look for these culture pieces, which are hard to identify in an interview. Anyway, there's just, I could go on and on and on, but you have to be intentional. And I think we were very quick to be thoughtful about how the culture pieces that we loved and that Conservice that is known for, like Conservice Cares, is our give back program. Every team member who's in good performance standing gets 2 hours a month to do community service. So we send out opportunities, like historically, it's like, oh, here's an opportunity to volunteer here or here, right? And they're very community centric. And then we had to start to say, well, how do people who live in a different state, how do we get them involved? How do we encourage that? And so we had to change the way we communicated about Conservice Cares. We had to broaden what was available or what we would allow, right? It didn't have to go through an approval process. We cut some of that red tape. And so that everyone could enjoy or experience Conservice Cares. And then as quickly people started to come back into the office, we then started to redo some of the things we had done, right? Like setting up opportunities for teams to go together, or setting up opportunities within the building instead of letting it be one, I'm going to choose myself what I'm going to go and do. I'm going to go donate blood, or I'm going to go read at this school. It could be my whole team is going to go together. And so we continue to try to be cognizant about creating and re-implementing group things, but also continuing to be aware of individual things that are available in that sense. And I think that's one of the things that makes Conservice pretty cool, is that we have these opportunities and we have some really important pieces that belong to the culture that we're trying to do company-wide.
That's fantastic. And honestly, I really loved how you mentioned being intentional and recognizing that the culture can change with, bringing new people in and depending on what roles they're in and those types of things. So a follow-up question that I had was, as you've been intentional with these different programs, like taking the Conservice Cares program, for example, and kind of cutting some of the red tape and making it more accessible for all team members, regardless of where they're living or working, how has that impacted the financial performance of the company? Like, have you seen any direct impacts?
I wish I could say yes, that I have laid my eyes on, a financial gain from something like that. But I do feel like attrition is something that is heavily impacted. And when we looked at the cost of turnover for an employee who doesn't actually make it to the point where they're through the training and they're actually adding value to the organization, it's relatively expensive. And it's been a long time since I looked at those numbers, but we're talking sometimes 10 grand, the cost to onboard an employee.
Wow.
So every time an employee is onboarded and they don't stay, right? They don't make it through training, or they don't feel like it's a good fit. That could be 10 grand lost. By the time you factor in all the elements of the leader's time and the trainer's time and the recruiter's time and the recruiting trainer's time, leader's time. There's just so many factors. Shipping computers, shipping them back. There's just so many pieces. But anytime we can create a connection on a personal level with an employee, then we have a higher chance of limiting that turnover, right? Or limiting the attrition. So that's super important to us, is how do we create those connections? And giving back is something that's super important. For some other team members, it could be something else. It could be the relationship with their team members, right? Their peers, or for me, it's the Diet Coke. It's right. It's on tap, free. If I had to buy it, my pay would go down substantially. So.
Hey, that's awesome.
Right. Well, whatever it is that you're connected to.
I love what Conservice has done. Like, I think what you're talking about is how much they've adapted despite COVID and all the things that you guys have gone through as a company. You've tried to purposefully hold on to parts of your culture that meant something to your employees.
Agreed.
And that has helped them stay with you guys through the thick and thin, right? Through some of the harder times and where there were a lot of adjustments that helped them feel a sense of consistency.
Absolutely. Yep. And, being one of the largest employers in Cache County, well, at least I think we're still the largest private employer. There's a reputation to withhold, right? People come here knowing what Conservice is and what we do. Well, they may not know what we do, because I'm not even sure I know what we do, but they know who we are and the values that we have been built on, right? The organization has been built on. And so we've worked really hard to establish that and maintain that, and making decisions around, oh gosh, I think about vaccinations and whether you had to or didn't. And there was a time where it was going to become law and it didn't. And we were diligently rewriting the policy and making sure we were considering all the circumstances, and then maintaining, a fair balance and equity and all those things. It's a tough job nowadays for any HR professional or even any company to think about, but the intention is the piece that I think is most important. You have to be cognizant of it. If you're not, it'll overrun. It'll become its own beast. And
there's always culture. It can be intentional or it can be a result of whatever's happening. So
Yep.
Let's shift gears here just for this next question, Julie. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about your role within the organization. So you're the Leader Development Director.
Mm-hmm.
And you the development of team members in people leadership roles. So how many people leaders would you estimate are at Conservice right now? Just ballpark.
We're sitting around 400, 450, it might be even closer to 500 that are actual people managers. They have people reporting to them.
Wow. So approaching around 500 active people leaders. Yeah. That's definitely a lot. As we chatted before this episode, you shared a term that I found very interesting called leadership inbreeding.
Oh dear.
So tell us a little bit about this. What does this term mean, and what are the pros and cons of companies experiencing leadership inbreeding?
Sure. And I use that word cautiously or with love, right? So let me tell you how I got to this, just so our listeners understand. So prior to me joining the organization, so prior to 2019, there had probably been maybe 2 or 3 individuals hired into the organization from an external into a leadership role. So they were external people hired into a leadership role. Every other leader inside the organization was promoted internally. So they all started in an internal, right? They all started in an entry level position and then were promoted up, which I will tell you is fantastic. And I love to tout that. And still today, we are probably in at least operations, we are still holding strong at probably 98% of our leaders in operations are internal promotions. We've had a handful and some changes and things, but most of them are at least our line level leaders. When you're talking about we have an ATL, a TL, and an STL structure. Outside of one person I can think in operations have been promoted internally, which for an organization is amazing. I love the idea that you can come in entry level and there's a career path for you. Prior to some restructure in our HR team, we had career coaches. That was their role, and they were to help people grow inside the organization. And most of the time it was grow up through leadership. Sometimes it was a skill change, right? Or a team change, but most of the time it was growth into leadership. And I love that. And it creates a really good environment of engagement and again, that connection to a career path. And people can come here and say, yeah, I want to grow, I can grow at Conservice. In fact, I was at lunch last week with a dozen or so, not quite, well, there's 10 of them, high performing leaders. And I was asking them at lunch, what did you want to do before you came to Conservice? Like, what did you want to be when you grow up? And none of them said, well, I want to, be a billing leader, right? Or I want to work at a company that does utility billing. Nobody says that. And most of them said, I didn't know. I didn't know what I wanted to be. And I love that there's a place for people like that who, I don't want to be a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer or, whatever. I don't know what I want to do, but I want to make a difference. And that's who ends up at Conservice. So here's the downfall, and this is why I call this a little bit of leadership inbreeding, is that because you don't have a ton of external influences in leadership style or leadership tools or leadership thinking, we tend to just learn from our leaders. And when they're all the same sort of type of leader, then we don't get a lot of diversity among the skill sets around our leaders. And so I call that that's why I call it inbreeding, right? I learned from my leader who learned from their leader who learned from their leader, and they've only been a leader at Conservice. And so that's one of the things that my role is tackling, is to diversify the thinking around leadership and being an avenue or allowing new thought and new process into the leadership styles and the leadership tools and how we influence and take care of our people.
And that is,
there you go. That's leadership inbreeding.
To me, that's pretty inspirational to be aware of, that unique kind of internal growth that's happening and capitalizing on the amazing positive elements of loyalty and trust that are built up there, while also intentionally going back to your theme of being intentionally incorporating other ways of thinking about leadership and welcoming other leaders that are coming in and being recruited from the outside to have this more cohesive culture of collaboration and one another and learning from each other with different backgrounds and skill sets and lived experiences. I think that's honestly really, really cool.
Well, thanks. I don't tout to say I know a better way, because Conservice has been successful and they were successful way before I got here. I'm just trying to create some other choices, I think. So it's not a replacement, it's an addition to. And I think that feels good, and people are embracing that, and that's a good thing. So
I really like that. It's adding on, it's helping take the culture where it needs to go into the future, right?
Yeah.
There's one of my favorite books, Work Inspired. It's by Aaron Ian. He talks about this principle of, the culture that got you to where you are today may not be the precise culture that will get you to where you need to go ahead. It doesn't mean you abandon everything. There are certain elements that can live on as you grow precisely, but other things need to evolve and need to mature respectively and appropriately to help drive the organization to the next phase. And the way that you're approaching that in the leadership development space is honestly really inspirational. So fantastic and great job with that.
Yeah, and I think the way that Conservice has attracted the talent that it has. And if it were to abruptly change, I think you would lose like such a vast majority of the people who are there for those reasons.
Yeah,
So
agreed.
you have to maintain some of that consistency, but you can work with what you have and try to train those leaders as they get into those positions and help them become better to the ones who they're over.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's one thing Conservice never lacked is applicants. Even through the pandemic, we were still getting way above average number of applicants. And so I love that people want to work here. And that's one thing we haven't had to fight for. So that just.
And what would you say are the top 2 reasons? That is, like, what are those 2 or 3 things that drive people to Conservice?
I don't know that I could say, because there are so many differences. I mean, again, like I said, I came for the Diet Coke, but
it's your soda machine. Maybe it's the fact that you're a growing company and that attracts the top talent. It's a secure place to work.
Yep.
And maybe there's something else. Maybe the Conservice cares, right?
Yeah. Well, and Krista, I think you hit on a couple of really good ones. First of all, we've maintained growth, even through what would feel like recessions, right? Because we started in 2000. So the recession of 2008 and 9, they continued growth there. We lived through the pandemic where lots of companies were scaling back. We were not. We're tied to in a lot of ways, we're tied to the housing market. And so when people are buying and selling a lot, then that creates more work for us. So there's some opportunities there, but utility billing, as sexy as it isn't, people recognize the stability that it brings, right? Everybody has to pay utility bills. That's never going to go away. That's not going to fluctuate when, inflation is high or inflation is low, or right, or the economy grows or slows, whatever. We're not a luxury, high-priced item. We are a commodity that everybody needs and uses, and so that is one of our, when you look at a value proposition for an organization, that's one of the things that I love to sell is the stability that comes from our industry. Unfortunately, it's not sexy. It's not entertaining. It's not fun. Yeah, it's super.
Yeah, there's a lot to that.
Yeah, but the stability sells itself, and that allows us to do some things financially that maybe other companies don't get to do. So.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. So just kind of wrapping up, we've got one other question for you, but we want to flip the conversation upside down and ask you, so you're currently supporting people leaders and helping them be successful. We'd like to hear about your experience on the receiving side. So tell us about a people first leader or mentor that made an impact in your career and life. What was the one thing that they did that made the biggest positive impact?
So I had a leader at a company prior to working here. Her name was Becky, and she was a great leader. She lived across the country. I lived here, so we didn't get to spend a lot of time together. But I recognized really early on when I would text her like, hey, I'm not feeling good, I'm going to work from home, or I'm going to take the day off. Her first response to me was not, okay, you can take the day off, or okay, that's fine. Her first response was, I'm so sorry. I hope you feel better. And I don't even know if she knew she was doing this intentionally, but that subtlety of putting me first over the approval, the policy, the rule, whatever it was, the situation, spoke to me in such a way that is something I have incorporated, that anytime someone's like, hey, I'm not feeling good, whatever, my first initial response is, I'm sorry that you're not feeling well, right? I always try to put the people first in my responses. I do that in emails when someone's saying, hey, I had an employee who mom died or was in an accident, my first response is always, how are they? Is everybody okay? And I have taken that, and that has actually changed the way I think about and how I talk to team members. When I was a direct leader, in this current role, I don't have direct reports, but very project focused. But when I was a people leader, that was something I implemented. And my husband he's a business owner and entrepreneur, and I have tried to encourage him to do the same things. Like when someone's calling in, which is frustrating when you're short staffed and it's all, but I'm like, your first response should be, are they okay? And so I've tried to put people first in any situation that I can. So Becky taught me that. She was a great leader, and I learned really quickly as well to, if I had a question about how to respond, if I took care of the employee, she didn't care. As long as I took care of the employee, that was always going to be her answer, and she supported me in that. So she was a really good example.
It's amazing how much of a difference being cared for by your leader, or the person who your direct supervisor, that the difference that makes on your job, your daily inputs.
Yeah.
And I think one thing I've seen from people is that they quit their job because they don't like their supervisor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when they have that feeling like my supervisor or my boss really cares about me,
Mm-hmm.
and then they feel loyal.
Yep,
And then back to
absolutely.
that attrition and solving those problems. And so being caring actually saves you money or makes you money, right? So
yes, right. If we're reducing turnover or increasing attrition because people are staying and they're working through the stressful time, or they're continuing to work through, or they're even in a space where they feel safe that they can address or talk to you about issues, that's a win-win for 100%. And that's going to hit your bottom line. I guarantee it. It's so hard. I can't even fathom how many times that will change your bottom line. But when an employee can say, hey boss, I don't feel safe, I don't feel respected, I don't feel heard, how do we fix that? That changes the game. So
Definitely.
super important.
Well, thank you so much for meeting on the podcast today. I think we hit on some really amazing things, trying to minimize turnover through caring about your employees, through training your leaders to be better for them, and also to be intentional about our culture and being consistent with those things that the employees care about. And we just want to thank you for being on the podcast with us today. You're amazing. You touched on so many good things. And thank you for our audience, all those who heard our podcast today. So let's prioritize profits by prioritizing people. Thank you.
I love it. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks,
See ya.
Julie.
See ya. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to the Culture Profit Podcast and for being a part of our journey to prove that putting people first is best for business.
Today's episode was sponsored by Mobrium.
Want to get more employee reviews and streamline your employer reputation? Visit mobrium.com.
Now go find one way to prioritize your people and watch your profits grow.